In 2012, a retired man from South Carolina submitted a routine DNA sample to a genealogy database. Nobody expected anything unusual. His relatives had been doing the same thing for years, quietly tracing family lines through slavery records and census documents the way millions African populations. It didn't match European populations. It didn't match anything documented anywhere in the global genetic database at the time. What they were looking at, buried inside the DNA of an ordinary American man, was something that predated the emergence of our own species. That man was Albert Perry, and his story didn't just change one family's history. It forced scientists to redraw the entire human family tree. To understand why this discovery shook the field so completely, you first need to understand how geneticists think about time. Every human being on the planet carries mutations, tiny spelling errors that accumulate in DNA across generations at a roughly predictable rate. By counting those mutations and comparing them between populations, researchers can calculate how long ago two lineages last shared a common ancestor. It works like a biological clock, ticking slowly across centuries, measuring the depth of our divergence from one another. Before Perry's DNA entered the picture, the oldest known branch of the human male lineage, the so-called Y-chromosomal atom, was estimated to be somewhere between 60,000 and 140,000 years old. That figure anchored the entire framework scientists used to reconstruct when and where the first modern humans appeared. Perry's chromosome demolished that framework. When researchers led by Fernando Mendez and Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona analyzed the sequence and published their findings in 2013, the numbers they reported were staggering. The lineage they were looking at, officially designated haplogroup AO0, had diverged from all other human Y chromosome branches approximately 338,000 years ago. The confidence interval stretched from 237,000 to 581,000 years. Even at the conservative end of that range, this lineage was older than the earliest anatomically modern human fossils yet discovered. In other words, Albert Perry, a man whose ancestors had survived the Atlantic slave trade, was carrying genetic instructions written before Homo sapiens, as a species, technically existed. The questions this raised were immediately uncomfortable for population genetics as a discipline. If a Y chromosome lineage that ancient had survived to the present day, what did that mean for every other assumption scientists had made about human origins? The standard model taught that all modern humans trace back to a relatively recent common ancestor in Africa, and that genetic diversity outside Africa is a subset of the diversity found within it. Perry's chromosome didn't fit. It sat at the root of the tree, deeper than any previously known branch, suggesting that somewhere in humanity's distant past, populations had separated and existed in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years before, eventually rejoining through interbreeding. Subsequent research confirmed that this lineage wasn't confined to one family in South Carolina. Geneticists searching global databases located the same ancient signature among the Mbo and Bangwa people of Western Cameroon and Central Africa, a small cluster of men carrying a paternal line so old that science had failed to account for it until the 21st century. That convergence, an African-American lineage tracing directly to a living West Central African community, was itself a quiet reflection of the history of the transatlantic slave trade, a wound in history that DNA had exposed. But here's what the Perry discovery really revealed, and why it matters far beyond one haplogroup or one family. It demonstrated that human genetic diversity is far deeper and far stranger than our models had assumed. It confirmed that the deepest branches of the human family tree are rooted not in Europe, not in Asia, not in the populations that built the civilizations that dominate history books, but in Africa, and specifically in populations that remained largely invisible to mainstream science until sequencing technology made their genetic signatures impossible to ignore. That revelation set the stage for a broader investigation that researchers have been conducting ever since. If one lineage could hide in plain sight for over 300,000 years, what other ancient signatures might still be present in living populations today? And if scientists actually ranked every major human population by the age of its genetic lineages, tracing not culture or language or skin color, but the raw molecular timestamps written into... Before scientists could rank populations by the age of their genetic lineages, they had to agree on what that question actually means. This turns out to be more complicated than it sounds, and the confusion around it has led to decades of misunderstanding, both inside the scientific community and far outside it. When researchers talk about a population having older DNA, they are not saying that the physical molecules inside those people's cells are somehow more ancient than molecules inside anyone else's cells. DNA degrades. Living humans carry fresh copies of their genetic code replicated constantly across their lifetimes. What scientists are actually measuring is something more subtle and more profound. They are measuring how long ago a given lineage last shared a common ancestor with everyone else. A population with older DNA is one whose ancestors separated earlier from the rest of the human family and remained distinct long enough for their genetic signature to diverge significantly. The greater the divergence, the deeper the branch. The deeper the branch, the older the lineage. With that definition in place, one group emerges from the data with a consistency that no serious researcher disputes. The Koisan people of southern Africa, also known as the San or Bushmen, carry the oldest known genetic lineages of any living human population on Earth. That conclusion does not come from a single study or a single institution. It has been confirmed by research published in Nature, replicated by teams at the J. Craig Venter Institute, supported by genome-wide analysis from Nanyang Technological University and Penn State University, and reinforced by a landmark paper published in Molecular Biology and Evolution by Oxford Academic. The evidence is as settled as anything in population genetics gets. Research published in the American Journal of Human Genetics examined 500 mitochondrial DNA sequences drawn from lineages concentrated in southern African populations. Two maternal haplogroups, designated L0D and L0K, represent what scientists describe as the deepest rooting maternal lineages in all of modern humanity. The split between those two lineages dates to approximately 145,000 years ago. The broader divergence between the Koisan lineage and all other modern humans has been calculated at no later than 90,000 years ago. To appreciate what that number means in real terms, consider this. Anatomically, modern humans did not begin leaving Africa in significant numbers until roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. The Koisan genetic line was already a distinct branch of humanity long before that migration ever began. The people who eventually became Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, and every other non-African population all descend from groups that left Africa after the Koisan lineage had already been separate for tens of thousands of years. What makes the Koisan case even more striking is the raw scale of their genetic diversity. A study published in Nature comparing complete genome sequences found that two Khoisan individuals from the Kalahari Desert were more genetically different from each other than a typical European and a typical Asian are from one another. That level of internal diversity is the hallmark of an ancient population, one that has had enough time and enough isolation to accumulate genetic variation that newer populations simply haven't had the generations to develop. Research from Nanyang Technological University and Penn State confirmed that Koisan populations had been the largest group of living humans, measured by effective population size, for most of the last 150,000 years. Their numerical dominance, in genetic terms, only ended around 20,000 years ago as agricultural expansion began reshaping the human world. But the Koisan are not alone at the deep end of the genetic timeline. The second major surprise in the data concerns populations living on the opposite side of the planet, and they arrived there in a way that required a feat of human capability so extraordinary that researchers at the University of Copenhagen described it as the first time in history that any human beings had deliberately crossed an open ocean. Aboriginal Australians and the Papuans of New Guinea represent, outside of Africa, the oldest continuous populations on Earth. A landmark genome study published in Nature, led by Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen, sequenced the complete genetic information of 83 Aboriginal Australians and 25 Papuans, and compared those sequences against populations worldwide. The results showed that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans diverged from Eurasian populations somewhere between 51,000 and 72,000 years ago, following a single wave out of Africa. European and Asian ancestral groups only became genetically distinct from each other around 42,000 years ago, meaning the Aboriginal Australian and Papuan lineages had already been on their own separate path for at least 10,000 years before Europeans and East Asians even parted ways from each other. More recent research, published in late 2025, produced by a collaboration between the University of Huddersfield's Archaeogenetics Research Group and the University of Southampton, refined this picture further. Analyzing nearly 2,500 complete mitochondrial genomes from Aboriginal Australians, Papuans, and neighboring Pacific populations, the team concluded that two distinct founding groups reached the ancient supercontinent of Sahul, which encompassed present-day Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, approximately 60,000 years ago via at least two separate maritime routes from Southeast Asia. These were not people who wandered across a land bridge by accident. They built watercraft, read ocean currents, and navigated open water to reach a continent they had never seen. By 31,000 years ago, Aboriginal Australian communities had become genetically isolated from one another, developing such profound internal diversity that the researchers described it as astonishing, even by the standards of ancient populations. The discovery that unnerved scientists most, however, was what that isolation preserved inside their genome. Around 4% of Aboriginal Australian and Papuan DNA does not match any known modern human population. It traces instead to an archaic human relative, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan in the conventional sense, but something else, a ghost lineage that interbred with the ancestors of these populations sometime after they left Africa and before they reached Sahul. That unnamed archaic contribution has since been the subject of intense, ongoing investigation because it suggests that the family tree of humanity, even among living people, contains branches that science. There's a discovery sitting in the scientific literature that almost nobody outside specialist circles knows about, and it changes the way the entire conversation about genetic age has to be framed. In 2022, a paper published in Scientific Reports by researchers affiliated with Family Tree DNA, the University of California, Riverside, and the National Geographic Society's Genographic Project announced the identification of a previously unknown mitochondrial haplogroup. They called it L7. Its estimated age was approximately 100,000 years old. That number alone would have been enough to make it significant. But what made L7 genuinely startling was where it had been hiding. For nearly 2 decades of intensive global genetic mapping, this lineage had been misclassified, folded into other haplogroup categories, its true identity obscured by the limitations of earlier sequencing methods. A human maternal lineage, 100,000 years old, had been sitting in the data the entire time, invisible, waiting for sequencing technology to become precise enough to see it clearly. L7 is found primarily among Central African rainforest hunter-gatherer populations, communities that have lived in the Congo Basin and surrounding forests for tens of thousands of years with minimal genetic input from outside. These groups, which include the Baka, the Aka, and the Mbuti, had long been recognized as genetically distinct. But the L7 discovery revealed that their distinctiveness runs even deeper than researchers had appreciated. Their maternal lineages branch off from the rest of the human mitochondrial tree at a point that predates not only the out-of-Africa migration, but a significant portion of the population structure that developed within Africa itself. Researchers writing in Scientific Reports described these Central African rainforest hunter-gatherers as preserving a layer of human genetic history that had essentially been invisible to science until the analytical tools became sophisticated enough to recover it. What this pattern reveals, taken together with the Koisan data and the Aboriginal Australian evidence, is something that fundamentally complicates any simple ranking of populations by genetic age. The deepest branches of the human family tree are not distributed evenly. They are clustered overwhelmingly among populations that shared one specific characteristic across their history. They remained hunter-gatherers. The Koisan in the Kalahari, the rainforest peoples of the Congo Basin, the Aboriginal Australians of the interior desert, all of them maintained ways of life that kept their populations relatively small, relatively isolated, and relatively free from the large-scale genetic mixing that accompanied the rise of agriculture. Agriculture, it turns out, is one of the most powerful genetic blending forces in human history, and the populations that adopted it earliest lost the deepest branches of their ancestral lineages through the sheer volume of admixture that followed. This is where the research produces one of its most counterintuitive results. The populations that most people would intuitively assume carry ancient DNA, the populations that built the earliest cities, the earliest writing systems, the earliest empires, turn out to carry some of the most genetically recent lineages when measured by the depth of their ancestral divergence. Researchers studying the genetics of populations across the ancient Near East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley have consistently found that these groups underwent massive genetic transformation during the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 years ago. As agriculture spread and populations expanded, collapsed, and mixed repeatedly across centuries, the ancient lineages that once existed in these regions were largely diluted, not erased, but submerged beneath wave after wave of migration and admixture. A study published in Nature in 2024 tracking the world's largest ancient human gene bank, built from the bones and teeth of nearly 5,000 individuals who lived across Western Europe and Asia up to 34,000 years ago, confirmed that the genetic composition of virtually every Eurasian population changed dramatically multiple times during the Holocene, the geological epoch that began approximately 11,700 years ago after the last ice age. That finding matters because it illustrates a principle that runs through the entire body of research on genetic age. Being first does not guarantee survival. Being ancient does not mean being unchanged. The human story, written in DNA across 300,000 years, is not a straight line from a single origin point to the present. It is a web of divergence, isolation, reconnection, extinction, and replacement, so tangled and so vast that every clean narrative built around it eventually breaks against the data. Scientists have noted that it remains unclear why. People in East Asia today carry more Neanderthal ancestry than Europeans, despite both populations descending from the same out-of-Africa migration event. The deeper researchers look, the more exceptions they find, and each exception opens a new question that the previous model had no room to ask. What the full body of evidence actually shows, when the haplogroup data and the ancient genome sequences and the population diversity studies are read together, is something far more interesting than any single ranking could capture. Genetic age is not a hierarchy, it is a map. The Koisan of southern Africa sit at the deepest root of the maternal tree, their L0 lineage diverging 90,000 years ago from all other living humans. The Embo and Bangwa of Cameroon carry the deepest known paternal lineage in haplogroup AZO0, a branch that split from the rest of humanity an estimated 338,000 years ago, according to the 2013 analysis published by Mendez and Hammer's team. The Aboriginal Australians and Papuans of New Guinea represent the oldest continuous populations outside Africa, their ancestors having separated from Eurasian lineages between 51,000 and 72,000 years ago, and remained largely genetically isolated for tens of thousands of years afterward. The Central African rainforest hunter-gatherers carry a maternal lineage, L7, approximately 100,000 years old, that science failed to properly identify until 2022. And somewhere in the genome of every living person on Earth, including people who have never thought about genetics in their lives, are traces of archaic human relatives, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and at least one other unnamed lineage, whose full story has not yet been told. The discovery that shocked researchers most was not any one of these findings in isolation. It was the realization that all of them pointed in the same direction. The oldest human DNA on Earth is not found in the ruins of the civilizations that built monuments and wrote histories. It is found among the people who were overlooked by those civilizations, the hunter-gatherers of the Kalahari, the forest communities of the Congo, the island peoples of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, the communities that history called primitive precisely because they did not build in stone. Their DNA tells a different story entirely. It says that while empires rose and collapsed and populations surged and mixed across Eurasia, these communities were quietly carrying something that no empire ever managed to produce. They were carrying time itself, measured in mutations, written in molecules, surviving across a span of years so vast it stretches back beyond the beginning of our own species. Science is still learning to read that record with the care it deserves. Every new sequencing project that reaches communities previously excluded from genetic databases adds resolution to a picture that has been blurry for far too long. The oldest human DNA on Earth has been there all along. It just took the right questions and the right technology and the willingness to look in the places history forgot to finally bring it into focus. If any part of this story surprised you, the comments section is the right place to leave your thoughts, and there's considerably more research in this direction worth exploring. The implication is profound. Genetic age and historical prominence are essentially uncorrelated. The populations sitting at the deepest roots of the human family tree are precisely the populations that history has most consistently marginalized, dispossessed, and failed to document. The San people of Botswana and Namibia, whose total population today is estimated at around 160,000 individuals scattered across southern Africa, carry a maternal lineage that diverged from all other living humans 90,000 years ago. The Embo and Bangwa of Cameroon carry a paternal lineage in haplogroup A or 0 that diverged an estimated 338,000 years ago, predating the recognized emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. These are not marginal footnotes to human history. In genetic terms, they are its oldest surviving chapter. The research also dismantles a separate misconception that has circulated in popular accounts of human genetics for decades. The idea that African populations are genetically uniform, single block of ancient humanity from which everyone else descended, turns out to be almost the opposite of the truth. A genome-wide study comparing 5 Koisan individuals against 420,000 genetic variants drawn from 1,262 genomes across 48 ethnic groups found that the Koisan are genetically distinct not only from Europeans and Asians, but from all other African populations as well. The internal genetic diversity of Africa is greater than the total genetic diversity of the rest of the world combined. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology have described Africa not as a single genetic origin point, but as a complex, internally structured landscape where multiple ancient populations developed in partial isolation across hundreds of thousands of years before any of them began moving outward. That structural complexity is written into the mitochondrial tree in a way that becomes clearer the more researchers sequence. The 7 traditional African haplogroups, labeled L0 through L6, represent branches that formed inside Africa across a period spanning from mitochondrial Eve, roughly 145,000 years ago, all the way forward to the agricultural expansion. The discovery of L7, dated to 100,000 years ago and misclassified for 20 years, suggests that even this picture remains incomplete. There are almost certainly other deep lineages still waiting to be properly identified as sequencing databases expand to include populations that have historically been underrepresented in genetic research, communities whose stories science is only now beginning to have the tools, and critically, the ethical frameworks to recover with genuine care. There's one more layer to this story, and it is the layer that tends to produce the most uncomfortable silence when researchers present it at conferences. The populations that carry the oldest genetic lineages on Earth are also, in nearly every case, the populations facing the most severe threats to their continued existence today. That is not a coincidence that science can afford to ignore, because the extinction of a population is not merely a humanitarian tragedy. It is an irreversible deletion from the genetic record of our species, a permanent erasure of information that no future sequencing project can ever. Lineage, branching off from the rest of humanity 90,000 years ago, contains mutations and genetic variants found nowhere else in the living human population. Researchers writing in molecular biology and evolution describe the Koisan as representing one branch of the earliest population divergence in all of Homo sapiens, with all other Africans and all non-Africans combined representing the other branch. That framing deserves a moment of reflection. Every person alive today who is not of Koisan descent belongs, genetically speaking, to the younger branch of the human family. The San are not a remnant of an ancient world. They are the senior branch of a living species, and their total surviving population across Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, and Angola numbers fewer than 160,000 individuals, a community smaller than many single cities, carrying a genetic heritage measured in six-figure years. The Central African rainforest hunter-gatherers, whose L7 lineage sat unrecognized in the data for 20 years, face comparable pressures. Deforestation across the Congo Basin has accelerated dramatically over the past 3 decades, destroying the ecosystems these communities depend on while simultaneously forcing genetic mixing with expanding agricultural populations in ways that progressively dilute the ancient lineages that remained intact through tens of thousands of years of isolation. The Andaman Islanders of the Bay of Bengal, who carry some of the oldest non-African lineages known to science and whose ancestors diverged from mainland populations after the initial out-of-Africa migration, have seen their numbers collapse to the point where several island communities face functional extinction within a generation. These are not abstract statistics. Each of these communities represents a branch of the human tree that, once gone, removes forever a window into what our species looked like genetically before the agricultural revolution began homogenizing the world. But here is where the science takes an unexpected and genuinely hopeful turn. The same sequencing technology that has revealed how ancient and how irreplaceable these lineages are has also begun producing discoveries that reframe the entire history of our species in ways that make the conventional story look radically oversimplified. When researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology sequenced the oldest modern human genomes yet recovered, drawn from individuals who lived in Germany and Czechia approximately 45,000 years ago, they found something nobody predicted. These earliest known Europeans, the first Homo sapiens to leave a genetic record in the continent, left no descendants among living people. Their lineage died out completely. The population that eventually gave rise to modern Europeans arrived later from a different direction, carrying different ancestral signatures.